All right.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay, so as most of you know, my name is Anne-Marie Dalton. I'm a retired professor from St. Mary's University, where for, I don't know, over 20 years, over 25 years, I think, I taught various courses, mostly in religion and ecology, or religion ecology in the developing world, or religion and science. They were all, I have a background both in science and in um, religion and culture, religious culture, in particular in relationship to the environment. I live here in Halifax, and I worship at St. Matthew's United Church. And Alida and I have taught together before, so special welcome to her and to the students. I've called this little introductory talk, which I hope to be about 15 to 20 minutes maybe, Ecological Citizenship, the Power and Role of Religion. Ecological citizenship is something that perhaps most people in this group already belong to. So in a sense, where I'm kind of not preaching to a choir, but I'm taking advantage of the fact that people are a kind of choir who already believe in the importance of ecological responsibility, and possibly will find themselves already described in what I'm going to say. I have brought together two things here. One is the sort of secular notion of ecological citizenship, because there is a discussion about that in the wider secular and academic circles. But I want to then pick up on how Pope Francis, in his famous encyclical now, Laudato Si', uses that term and enriches it within the religious context. So I hope that at least by throwing out a few ideas, I'll be able to give us another way to look at things, perhaps, for some of us anyway. Okay, so I'm starting off. You notice this slide up here has a little child drawing on the side. This is a picture that my great-grandson drew when he was about 5 or 6 years old. And it says, "I can show I love plants by watering them." So if you look over on one side, there's a very small boy watering the bottom of what looks like a pear tree, actually. I have this here along with the next slide, which is not going to move for me. Here it is. Because I want to talk about something called funding experience, which will have some relevance to the rest of the presentation, and will also give us something to sort of think about as we go through some of the notions which are fairly abstract. I put this at the beginning because I think it's worthwhile and helpful to have a kind of touchstone when we're talking about ecological citizenship to our own, how our own awareness and work in ecology were funded from the beginning. What were the funding experiences that brought us to where we are? And in fact, that would be a nice thing to talk about at some point. And just to give you an example of what I mean, so you can think along these lines, when I was often asked by students when I was teaching how I became so early interested in ecology, starting back in about 1969 or 70 in my undergraduate years. But actually I always answered them that I grew up in wilderness. It's not exactly, I had a home, but my home was wedged between a coniferous wild forest around a kind of ripe marsh, and on the other side, the usually raging Atlantic Ocean, about 30 meters from the front door of our family house at high tide. And if you haven't caught on already from my accent, that's in Newfoundland. Even the meadows that were scarcely tame, and between haying seasons, when the grass was cut, they sprouted spruce, tamarack, and fir every year. I went to sleep most nights lulled by the slapping waves near our home, or stayed awake, frightened of the wild wind that seemed to be taking the roof off our house. So what I'm saying is the funding experience for me, even with all the study I did afterwards, was actually the experience of childhood and a closeness to nature. And this might be something we want to think about as I'm doing the discussion of ecological citizenship. As we now know from scientific evidence, the landscapes of our early lives mold the bones, the flesh, and the consciousness of our bodies. It is the physicality of life, what we do, the habits we form, and yes, the ways in which what Christians call grace is mediated. It is this that bends the arc of our lives toward particular horizons. Ecological citizenship is not, however, the horizon towards which most of Western society, or even most of our religions traditionally, have aimed to bend. While some of us have had funding experiences that raise reactions of lament and grief, and may even act to confront environmental disasters, overall, being a citizen in modern democratic nations, being committed members of faith communities, has not prepared us for the new reality in which we find ourselves. When Pope Francis speaks in Laudato Si of becoming ecological citizens, he is not calling for an easy transformation, but he is calling for a kind of transformation that is deep, enduring, and always changing. Imagine that we have emerged, looking ahead, from this pandemic, that climate change is somewhat under control, and that we are substantially post-oil and coal as energy source. That would be great. Right now, the only way that that will happen is primarily through technological advances, quick fixes, given the time that we have remaining to do something. Vaccines, new medicines, solar panels and batteries, electric or hydrogen powered transportation. But if we do get there, can we then call ourselves ecological citizens? Okay, to look at, let us see, what Pope Francis didn't coin the term ecological citizenship, but he found it amenable to his response to the ecological crises. And I believe he brought to it a tradition and understanding that the secular term lacks. But let's first look at what it means in secular usage. Ecological citizenship has culture and sociological roots. It emerged near the end of the 20th century when a number of scholars began a discussion related to the notion of citizenship in general. But they were interested in the question of how to promote ecological citizenship within liberal democracies. How, as cultural or anthropological folks trained in those disciplines, could participate. What role does culture play in the response to the ecological crises? There were a number of key issues related. The question of rights was one, and whether or not the promotion of rights by liberal democracies can form the basis for an ecological citizenship. Is it sufficient? Is what they were asking. Is it sufficient in our understanding of rights to cover the issues that would emerge with a devastating natural world? Another one was, does the promotion of the notion of ecological citizenship refer to the private sphere? Is that where one would form ecological citizens? Or to the public sphere? And also, can the present legal and ethical notions of justice include justice for the future, for generations in the future, and for the natural world? So the overall question, as you can see here on the screen, really is, how do we bend democracy for ecological responsibility? Mostly the discussion, accompanying this discussion on ecological citizenship, of course, there was a whole move during the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century on new meanings for citizenship. Basically, in very clear terms, it was pondering the fallout of the overemphasis on rights to the neglect of responsibility. For example, is voting every few years and paying the requisite taxes the fulfillment of one's responsibility to others in a democracy? Now, this is something that may actually have been challenged during the pandemic, hopefully, and maybe we will emerge with a better sense of responsibility to each other at the end. We will see. So this is just a summary of the ones I just said, I think. Yeah, the contemporary emphasis on rights, the place where does ecological citizenship happen in the private or public sphere, and the understanding of justice. Okay, so what were some of the conclusions that they came up with? Different people came to different conclusions, but this is kind of a general overview of how people began talking about the answers to these questions. The questions led some to conclude that an environmental citizenship was possible within present democratic nation states, but by and large, the present nature of states was not conducive to what we call an ecological citizenship. And I'm not sure how many people have read or talked about or thought about the difference between environment and ecology, because we often use them interchangeably. But they're actually not. Environment is something separate from us around us, whereas ecology includes us in a sense of relationship or deeper relationship. So the questions led some to conclude that an environmental citizenship was possible, but that an ecological citizenship was at least a lot more difficult. The modern nation state is based on a contract. The citizen is one who is guaranteed certain rights in return for some mostly legalized obligations. Vote, pay tax, obey certain agreed upon laws. The overseeing of this is invested in representatives, voted usually by the citizens. The notion of environment considers the other than human world as supplying the resources required for human well-being, or as a stage on which human life is performed. On its own, the other than human natural world is managed for the good of humans. On its own, no ecosystem, species, or individual plant or animal has rights. They obtain their value relative to their potential to serve human needs. So an environmental citizen could be motivated and even could be required to protect the environment for the sake of humans. Humans have a right to a clean environment, an economic source, materials for shelter, and for recreation. And for that reason, environmentalists argue, we ought to protect nature. All of this is subject to the contract inherent in the nation state. In most of the Western world, at least, it's easy to see the biblical Christian sources of these views, the drive for human rights and the elevation of the human as the crown of creation, God specially chosen, next to the angels, and gifted with the rest of creation. Stewards, maybe yes, but still entitled to the rest of creation. Ecological citizenship, it is claimed, doesn't neatly fit into this conception of the modern state. While in favor of human rights, it looks primarily at a balance between human rights and a responsibility of individuals, communities, and governments. The kind of change necessary to address the present ecological crisis cannot be entirely or sufficiently legislated. It calls for an extension of compassion and justice to future generations, to strangers, including the non-human creatures now and in the future. A state committed to impartiality and based on rational argument, cannot call forth the level of commitment needed for such responsibility, given the non-reciprocal nature of such acts. This calls for a reordering of the priorities and a transformation in consciousness at many levels, from the individual to family units and to all social institutions. Such a transformation recognizes the role of art, music, education, nature appreciation, meditation, and more broadly, aesthetic and spiritual practices as transformative. It does not annul the necessity of contracts or recognition of rights, but broadens and redefines the context to one in which humans are species whose faith is tied inextricably to the faith of the earth as a whole. So in broad strokes, this is basically the meaning of ecological citizenship. Now, I'd like to turn to Pope Francis and his use of this term. And on this slide we have here, I've just drawn out just a few phrases from the section in which that term occurs when he's talking. It's mostly in the section where he's talking about education. And so you'll see them on here. So if you look, you'll see some of the words: an awareness of the gravity of the crises and the necessity of translating it into new habits. It's very profoundly obvious throughout the whole document, the recurrence of the words habits and virtues. And it is especially so here when he's talking about ecological citizenship. So in the second line is where he actually uses the phrase, education aimed at creating an ecological citizenship is at times just providing information, but fails to instill good habits. So you'll notice that he's making this distinction between a sort of rational and intellectual understanding and a practice of ecological citizenship. Education must give ecological ethics its deepest meaning, meaning stretching into creation and its role in ethics. The education called for is not confined to schools. As you can see, he's talking about it in a wide range of places where people receive information and formation, and he also includes the church. And must enable people to grow in solidarity, responsibility, compassion, care. And this requires an ecological conversion attached to becoming an ecological citizen and a leap toward the transcendent. So these phrases, notice, requires a new conversion and a leap toward the transcendent. So basically he's moving into the realm of religion. Virtues and habits are repeated throughout the encyclical, though somebody has made a study of the ones mentioned the most, and they are praise, love, gratitude, care, justice, work, sobriety, which he attaches to leaving behind addictions to consumerism. He's not talking about drugs or something, and humility. In connecting virtues and habits in this way as needed for ecological citizenship, the Pope is leaning on an ancient Christian tradition. Indeed, the origin of the notions of virtues and habits. The word for this tradition is habitus, a Latin translation of a Greek word, hexes. These original words carried the meaning of habit, not as something involuntary or done without thought or outside of the moral calculus. So when connected to virtues as habits, it carried a dynamic sense of virtue. Virtue is not something static or acquired, but something one learned to invoke in the face of decisions, not as a set of tools, but more akin to a set of processes. The new way, which is what Christianity was originally known as, relied on a socialization process in which you participated in acts of virtue within a community and took on a new kind of world. You lived in a new habitus, dynamically focused around a way of serving, a way of going about everyday life, a way of sanctifying one's surroundings and all the major happenings of life. People were converted to a different way of living as a member of a community where certain virtues were invoked and practiced as witness to their faith. Now, we all know, if you know anything about the history of Christianity, of course, you know that a lot of this became hardened into not so great a witness to faith and all kinds of problems being addressed down through history. And the Pope knows about that, obviously, and has spoken about the dangers inherent in some forms of Christianity. However, that doesn't mean that the habitus, as it was engaged in the beginning, was not successful and worthwhile. Now, much of the power of this more ancient tradition is now scientifically supported as an important facet of human well-being and change. Examples, the role of language. If you think of how earnestly feminists went about changing language and critiquing language. Also in art and symbolism, think about the furor about certain statues around a city. These are all powerful emblems and symbols of whole ways of life. Clothing, music, poetry, media, all of these are powerful in creating citizenship, even dangerously so when used for bad ends. So this conversion in Christian, the freedom to act anew is what I argue, well, I don't just argue, but a lot of people have pointed out, is what gives this kind of deeper call that Pope Francis has given to an ecological citizenship. And I just put up a couple of slides to kind of give you an example. Here's a book written by a woman called Rebecca, I think her last name is Moby. And she's claiming that chant was used in Christian formation in Iberia, and claims that it contributed to a sort of evolving of a peaceful culture and is very much at the heart of what Iberia is today. So it talks about the relationship between chant and citizenship. You also notice the emergence of the catechumenate, one of the pictures there, which is one of the places, of course, where the new way of Christianity was built in the early church. And, the stained glass windows at the bottom, which told the stories. You can just think of all the artifacts of Christian culture that contributed to the formation of citizens historically. And here are some others, a young boy reading the Bible, people praying before eating, a church, all of these contributed to the creation of this habitus. Okay, so psychologists even tell us that our habitus, our ingrained values and habits are quite difficult to change. And so it's in a sense, it's so ingrained, so builds us from our early lives that to change our habitus, so for example, to an ecological citizenship is not impossible, but it's not easy. It's not something that one has to look upon as something that can happen just by reading a book or such. In other words, it requires an entire culture, it requires community, it requires individual hard work. For the Pope, he calls it a conversion. Now, conversion, as all of you know, I'm sure, is also something that's quite substantial in one's life. It's not easy. It takes, of course, from the perspective of faith, it takes the movement of grace or of divine love, but it also requires work, follow-up, mediation, all those things. So the Pope is looking for this. And I have put up here, this actually is a kind of list of facets of conversion that have been defined and explained and talked about by Bernard Lonergan, who is a Canadian theologian, one of the people I studied for my thesis, actually. But he's known to have this very well thought out dynamic description of conversion. I'm not going to go through all this. It took Bernard Lonergan a huge book to explain them. But I want to point out one that we don't think about a lot and which I think has a lot of relationship to how an ecological, what is meant by an ecological conversion or how it might happen. So, and this one is the psychic conversion, the conversion of the psyche. Linda might have a lot of things to add to this, being a psychologist. Our psyche, as you know, contains all the experiences that have been part of our lives, much of it even unconscious, but still active. For example, in the case of, if you think of traumas of early childhood, for example, we're all aware of how this can influence all aspects of our lives, even when we don't remember the traumatic experience itself. So there's a sense in which the psyche can be considered a sensor. And I'll illustrate with an example. So imagine that you're faced with a decision about supporting the clear cutting of no growth forest. You have to give the final go ahead or not. So you stand in front of the forest patch. And if this is in Nova Scotia, an old growth forest would look like scrappy small trees, mostly bowed by the prevailing winds, roots obviously bound around protruding rocks and marshy scrub. Your community is poor. You grew up in poverty. You're no longer poor, but suddenly, as you face this decision, a flow of images and feelings of an impoverished upbringing, struggling parents, a community dying, are flooding your consciousness. There are some small competing voices of environmentalists and biodiversity and future generation rising and then falling from consciousness. The images and voices to you are those of comfortable city dwellers far removed from your reality. Those who don't have to worry, the rich ones who you knew as a child. You feel angry, oppressed. After all, these are just trees. We can replant them. We have the equipment, we have the technology, and so on. Your rational decision is being based on the data that winds its way out from the psyche, that which is not censored, that which is deep enough to censor others. Psychic conversion is a healing of the censor that controls the images that flow into our decisions and actions. Funding experiences of early life are operative here. This example is individual, but community and society play a huge role. Long ingrained attitudes and practices toward the natural world and its exclusion, for the most part, from our moral compasses, means that consideration of any rights or the exercise of compassion with regard to other creatures or ecosystems are rarely operative in the censors that inform our intentional decisions and actions. Ecological citizenship, understood as habitus, works to heal the censor by supplying data, images, visual, auditory, even smells, tastes, encouraging and supporting different habits to the psyche. Cultural and religious so-called soft aspects, such as art, experiences in nature, counseling, careful language about nature, redefining the humanist species, compassionate toward all creatures, music, you can go on, contemplation, meditation, giving creation a prominent place in religious language, ritual and practice, establishing relationship between religious symbols such as water and the necessity of respecting it, holding up the giftedness of creation for all, redefining ownership of nature, especially on behalf of creation, insisting on public discourse that is nature informed and correct. All of these work to convert the psyche. I think religion finds its power here. So let me conclude with an image of where I think we might be at the moment. This picture of these finely dressed young gentlemen over here is a 1914 photograph called Three Young Men on Their Way to a Dance by August Sanders. It's a German. The photo is most popularly known because of its use by Richard Powers as a title for his first novel. In Powers' use, the dance for which the young men are prepared is not the one at which they arrive. Note it was 1914 and at the beginning of World War I. So in Powers' novel, the world is about to change as these young men arrive here. Opposite this picture, on the other side, well, first of all, in a way, these young men are where we are, clothed in a society and a set of practice, a lifestyle characterized by consumerism and inequality, maintained by the virtues we have habituated. The other photos are of different dances, and the juxtaposition indicates the depth and width of the gap that we have to close. So you see the native peoples for whom, of course, dance is always closely related to the natural world. And at the bottom, a mating dance by two herons. And just by accident, this picture of this snake appeared when I was trying to move around pictures, and I left it there behind the men. We all know that the snake is an amazing image within Christianity, and a good example of how something can change totally its meaning in a society, because prior to the editing of the stories that went into the book of Genesis, the snake, of course, was a sacred animal within many of the so-called pagan religions around which Yahwism evolved. And you remember that in the story of the first parents, the snake becomes the instrument of evil. And so it has had quite a different history within our own religious sort of upbringing and tradition. Anyway, it's quite interesting that it sort of appeared there on its own. So this big gap, though, between these dances that we have here, one where we in our own society are totally unprepared for the kind of place where we arrived and in which we have to dance, and the other of examples that of dances which are much more integrated into the natural world. However, just as in the notion of ecological citizenship, these were earthbound dances that we recognize have a fascination for us, because we are, after all, still creatures of the earth. And that is deep within us. This, our own dance is connected to the dance of the herons. We probably wouldn't have a dance if the herons hadn't had one. We all come from the same place. So this fascination is a deeply human pull to create a different dance and a new ecological way. And I will stop there and see if we have some questions or comments. Thank you.
Nancy, you're muted. And everybody can unmute, as a matter of fact, because this is more a conversation than it is a question and answer.
Yeah, if you have a question you'd like to ask at this time, please do, or if you want to put it on chat. I found that fascinating. I'm thinking.
It's a lot. It was a lot of stuff. Tried to condense it into 10 to 15. I mean, the whole thing was written in a chapter, which is, I don't know, 20 pages or something.
Well, it gives me a good introduction to start reading L'Audacio Si, which is in the bedroom, and I haven't read it yet. So,
Alida, you have you want to make a comment, or?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Anne Marie. I really appreciated your talk. That's wonderful. As Anne Marie mentioned, we taught together, so I just feel like I'm in that space again. So that's wonderful. I have two questions. When you say that you think religion finds its power in the psychic, I just wondered if those, the intellectual, the moral, and religious, the way that it's described by Lonergan, there's just this interplay and textural interplay between all of them, so that I don't know if I'd want to isolate any of them, because the psychic involves the intellectual and the moral and so on. That's my first question. And the second question, we both know Kathleen Scarrett, who's a lovely human being. And I think she uses the term more than reciprocity. I had the advantage, Anne Marie gave me this article to read, so I had the advantage of being able to read it instead. And I think you used the word
Non-reciprocal.
Yeah, and I just wondered if what you think about the term more than reciprocity, it to possibly, because it kind of struck me that unreciprocal maybe takes you in a different direction. It takes away, because even if something's toward a future, it can't be paid back. I just wonder if you can explore the idea of unreciprocal and maybe more than reciprocity.
Okay, I'll answer
what
that
you want to say.
because actually I'm using the language that the secular people talking about the place of ecological citizenship. That's the language they use. They say, so they're talking about it in a kind of an almost legal way, so that rights within our society, people are given certain rights. There's a reciprocity about it. You get protection or whatever in return for fulfilling laws and paying taxes. It's that kind of legal thing. So what they're saying actually is, if you're talking about 7 generations down, or you're talking about protecting an ecosystem, well, maybe somebody will get reciprocated, in 7 generations, but you won't. I think that's the sense. I do like Kathleen's way of talking. If we're talking, if we're talking in the immediate, and I'm protecting this forest, then this is that's a different relationship, because I'm actually benefiting more than I'm actually giving. So yeah, I do like the more than reciprocity, but that's actually not my language. The non-reciprocal is the language they use in this kind of explanation, and why they see it as problematic. Okay, so power to say yes. I mean, I even thought, maybe I won't talk about conversion at all, because Bernard Lonergan has this amazing, he has a huge book that is basically just describing all these different facets of conversion, and ending up with religious conversion, and then making it more specific to Christian conversion through the mediation of Christ and so on. No, they are all definitely interact. It's just that the psyche, in fact, he doesn't do a really good job on the psyche. It's been explored more later in another huge book by Doran. I think his name is Dermot Doran. I'm not sure his first name. No, Robert Doran, Canadian Jesuit, who just took Lonergan's mention of the psyche and of feelings and emotions and wrote an entire book about it. So the reason I mention it is because it is the place, first of all, very much neglected, but also it is the place where sensitivity to arts, emotions, and all these sorts of things get their power or their act. Obviously, the psyche alone, without the conversion of the intellect, is also dangerous. In fact, all of them can be very distorted if you don't have a complete base. Just think of some some Christian groups for whom conversion is, you walk in on a Sunday morning and the pastor says something very moving, and all of a sudden you are converted and you walk out the door as a new person. Now, we can't all judge how genuine these all are, but for the most part, the sort of emotional high of this is not exactly what Pope Francis is talking about as conversion, right? It's this complex interplay of all the aspects of human life. So yes, thanks for pointing that out. You know, it is distorting to just talk about one particular aspect. But I just wanted to hold up this is where the habitus has most of its power to affect the others.
I have a question from Dr. Hayter.
Okay.
Yes, actually, I have a question and I have some reflections. Probably I need to take 3 minutes only. My question is, where was the church actually before Pope Francis and even the Vatican Council II, you know, reflected on modernity and the new images and that Pope Francis brought in? That's my question. So what happened during the previous centuries? How was the ministry and the priest used to deal with other faith leaders, religious leaders, when it comes to to secure our planet? What is their philosophy actually? And what is the language? Talking about the language actually of eco-theology, there are certain parts of that which it contains words, images, movements, and sounds, and feeling and understanding, of course. Landscape, soundscapes, reflex and feeling. And the second reflection, it comes on creation and humankind, earth and humankind. And that takes us to Genesis 1, verse 11 and 24, and then Genesis as well, chapter 1, verse 20, where it says, let the earth put forth vegetation, let the earth bring forth living creatures. We talked about the creatures, of course, of every kind. That's Genesis 1, verse 11 and 24. And let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures. That's Genesis chapter 1:20. So we are all creatures, as we know, you know, animals, human being, and so on. When we share the same land, the same climate, and now the climate changes will affect everything, all the creatures, animals, insects, snake, you know, from the Bible, and us, of course. Mm-hmm. So we are the land, we are part of each other, and we complete each other.
Okay, I think you said the first part was a question around yeah. I guess I can respond to both of these. I don't see them as questions. I think I agree with what you're saying. If you look at the Christian tradition generally, no matter which way it then turns, whether pro-Reformation, after Reformation, pre-Reformation, or early church or medieval times, what you get is a very ambiguous sort of relationship between, you know, in terms of ecological responsibility. First of all, the kind of ecological problems that we're facing post-industrial age are nothing like, you know, they're not the kinds of problems that people were facing from the beginning over the history of, let's say, the Bible or any other religions. So it's, you know, but you'll always find, you know, you'll find the Benedictines, for example, you'll find Franciscans, you'll find different traditions, and not always the mainline tradition, but you will find traditions in which the earth is held up as being very sacred. Creation itself, the whole word creation is a holy word. I mean, scientists don't believe in creation. They believe in evolving earth that came from somewhere. You know, some of them might use I was at a conference actually at the poor Capitol building, which is now, when I was in Washington. And it was held by Al Gore and Carl Sagan. brought together a group of people to discuss religious and scientific attitudes towards the natural world and to make some kind of a statement to their Congress people, visit their offices and so on, when I was studying in Washington. And there were Christians there of all stripes. Well, the word creation caused a problem for the scientists. They didn't want to put that into the statement, some of them. So we had to start the statement by saying, no matter where you believe that the natural world came from, you couldn't say creation. So creation means already touched by God, touched by the divine, whatever. So if we explored creation theology, which in fact was quite undeveloped within the Western tradition, compared to, let's say, incarnation theology, redemption theology, the whole, the whole of the world is held by this religious tradition and by other religious traditions as well as having a sacredness about it. So that's there. I mean, you can go back and find lots of aberrations. Destroying trees which were considered to be pagan objects and destroying whole forests by Christians gone crazy trying to destroy idolatry and things like that. But basically, the tradition holds together, always holds a kind of sacredness of creation. For example, an often quoted one from Thomas Aquinas is about there's no one thing that actually can reflect by itself the greatness of the glory of God. So therefore you need everything that there is in creation. A lot of people use this as a kind of a challenge in favor of biodiversity and against the extinction of species, that you're actually bringing an extinction to a voice of God within that sort of understanding of the world. So there's lots there. We don't have an excuse to say that the entire tradition has put us off, but we do have to recognize that there are some things which probably need some correction. That's how I would answer that. And, in terms of the Catholic Church in Vatican II, yes, it opened to the world and so on, but there's very little in Vatican II that's really has an ecological bend. It sort of started to happen after that, I think. And all religious leaders, I think you mentioned this as well. Most religious leaders in the world now have made important statements regarding, responding to the ecological crises and so on. So statements are all there, but we probably need more than statements. Yeah.
We probably have room for one more question. I have a question if no one else does, but if you do, I'll defer. All right, I shall. One word that you haven't said at all is the word love.
Oh,
And
well, just listed it as a virtue, but yeah, you're right. I did.
it's very interesting because that's the focus. For example, Citizens for Public Justice are in their book, Love of Creation, are presenting the idea, which I agree with, that it's love of place, love of creation, which will in a way transform us. And I found this, I never read Lonergan, never went that way. So I found psychic more, I always find it's interesting when people talk about him, but I haven't read him. So what do you say about that? So that's one question that I'm curious about. Where does love fit in here? Is that a key factor in transformation?
Yeah, well, in the Pope's, it's one of the most repeated words in Laudate Si, in terms of the virtue. So no, I haven't. I didn't talk about it in this because I don't know, just in. But it is all about love. I mean, your sense of responsibility is for creation is about love of creation. I mean, obviously you can care for creation for many different reasons, and even that would be a step forward. But from a religious and aesthetical sort of perspective, cultural perspective, certainly you work to save that which you love. So, definitely, yes, love. And he brings together the love of people and the extension of justice to the poor and globally, together with the love of creation. He sees this as all one part of something that's interconnected and that we're all called to. You know, there's a lot more in the whole. I was just focusing on this sort of one idea, but there is a lot more in the document that's not covered by just talking about ecological citizenship.
Well, I'm glad we taped this. I'll watch it again. There's some things yes, I'll watch it again. A lot of ideas. This is where I pass it over. Anne-Marie, you've got final words, and then I pass it over for Marion for final words.
Well, I'd just like to thank everybody for coming and, you know, enduring through this. I'm not the greatest at presenting at 7 o'clock at night. I'm, you know, past retirement age. So anyway, and thank you very much to the students, to Alida and the students from ASD for showing up, and good luck with this lovely course. I know because I've seen the syllabus. It's great. You're very lucky. Take care, and everybody. Thank you.
Marion, Mother Marion.
Okay, well, getting back to St. Francis for a bit, when I was a student at AST in my first year, my formation director, during a conversation the two of us had, she asked me what I knew about St. Francis of Assisi, and I said, not much. And so anyway, she introduced me to my best friend, St. Francis, and it became a very inspiring moment. One of the ways that I refer to creation, and actually I talked, we had a meeting yesterday with the Minister of the Environment, Gordon Wilson, who was well versed on so many subjects, but I wanted to approach it from a spiritual perspective when it came to my time. You know, we are the church. And so I talked about hope and a message of hope, but I also talked about the creation story and the interdependence of all things, looking at the creation story from that perspective. And this is just kind of flight of ideas here, but when you talked about conversion, I thought that was an extraordinarily important moment for me, because although the Environment Network is absolutely not a tool for evangelism in the traditional sense, I consider myself more an ecological evangelist than anything else, because one of the things that I do strive to do is help bring people into the idea that we should love creation and then we'll embrace it, but that we're also part of it, and an important part of it, because we do have a significant impact. That track record isn't great right now, but we can turn that around, I think. And it's not just about stewardship, although I also talk about God's commandment as the first commandment in the Bible, to care for creation, not to subdue it, not to own it, to work with it. So thank you so much. It was great. I want everybody who hasn't been here before to know that you are all welcome to come at any point in time. I did leave contact information on the chat line, and if you want to be connected to our network, and this is the sales pitch, you could just supply us with your email, and then you just kind of get on the list, or connect with us by Facebook. It's not just an Anglican thing. It's open to anybody and everybody. Anybody who cares about creation.
Next week, this was Stella's introduction. Brianna Maxwell is going to be talking to us about homelessness and climate. So everyone's welcome, and yeah, that'll be the next one. Anne-Marie, that was great.
Thank you.
Fascinating.
Nice to see you all.
There were a couple of questions in the chat. We didn't get a time, but I might be able to answer them later on. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Have a good evening.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It was lovely.
Good night.
Thank you.
For listening to you all. Bye-bye.
Oh, I'm gonna let you all sign off yourselves.
Marion, stay for a minute.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night, Tim. Good night, Eleanor. Good night, Eva.
Thank you. It was lovely.
Good night, Melanie. Good night, Judith. Good night, Dr. Hayter.
Bye-bye. God bless. God bless
God
you.
bless.
And also with you.
Bye-bye.
Um,
I'll just let him finish. We'll let you sign off, Dr. Hayter. Can you sign out of the meeting yourself, leave the meeting yourself, Dr. Hayter? I think he's still there.
I could call you.
You can do that, or we can just zip right back into another Zoom meeting.
Let's do that. I'll come right back in, okay?
Okay.
Oh, I'll send you an invite.
Oh, yeah, we need a new invite.
Be right back.